Hello and everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Welcome to the 2020 US HAEA Virtual Capitol Hill Day, and thank you for taking some time out of your schedules to join us today. I'd like to be the first to say that we miss being with you all in person. The HAEA community is truly a family, and although we can't be together in person, it's wonderful to see so many community members here with us today to learn about the issues that impact people affected by HAE and the importance of advocating during these challenging times. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please submit them through the chat bar at the bottom of your screen, and either Dane or myself will answer them sometime throughout the presentation. I would like to introduce our first speaker, the US HAEA's President and CEO, Mr. Anthony Castaldo. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, John, and welcome to all of our HAEA friends, and thank you for participating in our 2020 virtual Capitol Hill Day. While the COVID pandemic prevents us from meeting in person this year, the record level of participation in this event today offers overwhelming evidence that nothing is going to stop the HAEA community from vigorous advocacy efforts. And those are aimed at educating our elected representatives through our individual stories and clearly communicating our public policy agenda. The issues we address in our legislative advocacy program are vitally important to people in our community. And that's going to come across loud and clear when you hear from three HAEA friends who will share their stories with us today. Also, as you'll hear later, Senator Cramer and Congressman Connolly, two people that are actually members of Congress, are going to talk about how our elected representatives want to hear from us. And that's why the efforts that our passionate HAEA grassroots advocates have put forth over the years has produced tangible results, such as the US Senate's recognition of May 16th as National HAE Day, obtaining bipartisan support for HAEA-endorsed legislation on a variety of patient protection measures, and an increase in HAE-targeted NIH funding. And those, my dear friends, are just to name a few. Well, one thing has become very clear in this COVID-19 era. A well-organized and vigorous HAEA advocacy effort is more important than ever. This year, our asks center around patient care issues and funding from NIH and CDC. With regard to patient care issues, I want to make sure that everyone in our community is aware that the US HAEA is leading a nationwide coalition of rare and chronic disease organizations who are working to pass a law that establishes a statutory framework to fight looming threats faced by charitable assistance. This financial support provides a crucial safety net that is essential for all people who could otherwise not afford copays and high insurance premiums. The stakes are really high. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Dane Christensen, the Executive Vice President for the Health and Medicine Council of Washington. And they are the group that represents our interests on Capitol Hill. Dane has worked with the HAEA for over a decade, has uncanny knowledge and skill regarding the legislative process, and has been a featured speaker at many of our HAEA events. Dane will explain the HAEA's legislative priorities and provide you with guidance on how to go about contacting your elected officials to get results. HAE friends, please welcome our great friend, Dane Christensen. Dane?
Thank you, Tony. I appreciate that great introduction. For those of you who don't know me or haven't seen me on another webinar, my name is Dane Christensen. I'm Vice President at the Health and Medicine Council. It's been an honor and a privilege to work with the hereditary angioedema community for so long. I think everyone's gotten used to the fact that 2020 is a little bit of an interesting year. We've had to adapt, Capitol Hill has had to adapt, but we still need to keep moving our legislative agenda forward. This training will be, I know that there are a lot of folks that also participated in the Coverage and Access Forum that happened recently. That's a broad event for the entire rare and chronic disease community. Today, this will be a different presentation, and we're going to be talking about some of those issues that are more specific to hereditary angioedema specifically. So I do want to stress, though, that the Capitol is closed right now, but Congress is working. And also, this is a very charged political time, but we're going to be talking about policy, not politics. Just as an example, if you wanted to visit your member of Congress, you would almost certainly not be able to do it in DC right now. The congressional buildings, if you want to get into them, it's like, one of the scenes from ET where they take all your stuff, they put you in plastic, you need a security escort. And even if you do all that, your members' offices are probably closed. So we have to do this in a virtual format. It's the way that things need to be done right now. But that doesn't mean we can't be effective. And that doesn't mean that members of Congress, particularly in election year, don't want to hear from their constituents. Particularly if there's a chronic disease community that they're trying to represent. So this will be a virtual Hill Day. A lot of this presentation will be the same as other Hill Days, with the exception of how do we do outreach if we're doing it in this virtual format. So this will be about a 20-minute presentation on my end. The overall event will be longer. We'll have some great presentations from patient advocates. We'll hear from some of our congressional champions, but this will just be about 20 minutes of instruction. It's going to be a brief issue. We're going to do a broad overview of what's happening on Capitol Hill. We're going to do the specific issues impacting the community. And then we are going to close with how to conduct, virtual outreach. There is a Q&A function in the bottom of the screen. That's the easiest way to ask questions. John and I can help answer those either at a break in the presentation or in the chat box. But we will be using that Q&A function so that the presentation can keep moving forward. But we will try to address any questions that anybody brings up. Next slide, please. So what's happening at Capitol Hill right now? I think folks are aware of the fact that the Congress is working, even if they have this kind of modified approach and you can't actually go in the buildings and see your members. Of course, the confirmation hearings for Amy Coney Barrett were just on TV. Those were in the congressional office buildings. They're debating a COVID package, but by and large, Congress has adapted to this kind of hybrid framework where members are either doing these hearings remotely, the staff are almost certainly doing these hearings remotely, but they are still having a legislative agenda they have to juggle. They got a campaign to get through, and they got constituents to meet with. So what are the broad things that Congress has been working on Capitol Hill? What is the bigger dynamic backdrop that we go into our advocacy against? And the first is the fiscal year 21 budget and appropriations process. A couple of the issues that we're going to be talking about today are going to be funding issues. So this is when Congress decides how much money to give to certain priorities. How much money do they give the Department of Agriculture? How much money do they give to medical research? How much money do they give to the FBI? They're still making those decisions. If they don't make those decisions, the government shuts down. And the government would have shut down on October 1st, except for the fact that Congress passed in a bipartisan way what's called a continuing resolution to keep the government functioning until in this case, December 11th. So they are going to be campaigning right now. The election is going to happen on November 3rd. Then they're going to come back at the end of the year, and they're going to have to decide how to resolve both key funding issues, how much money do all programs get, and also legislative priorities. What bills are we going to pass at the end of the year? They're going to be making decisions now for how they're going to dispense with all this business. So we do know what the House of Representatives has done in terms of budget and appropriations process. They've called for large increases for NIH. They've called for large increases for public health and the CDC. We don't know what the Senate thinks about these things. The Senate has not put its spending bills forward. They normally would in a traditional year. And the reason why we don't know the Senate position on these funding issues is because of this protracted effort to do another COVID-19 response. So anybody savvy, reads the news or watches the news pretty regularly, that Congress has done a few of these COVID packages. The COVID packages have provided economic relief. They provided money for businesses and nonprofits. They provided, in some cases, checks to people who may be out of work. They've also provided economic stimulus and basic, what's called emergency appropriations for federal agencies. So there has been more money for medical research. There has been more money for the CDC, but that money is just for COVID and it's just for this emergency period. It's not part of the base budget. It doesn't contribute to other efforts, but that's what Congress has been focused on. And they've been trying to do one more package. The Senate has wanted to do a package that's about $500 billion. The White House wants a $2 billion, $2 trillion package, and the House wants a package that's $2.2 trillion. So they got to negotiate. They've been negotiating, and ultimately they have to arrive at an agreement. And then that will allow anything to pass the House, pass the Senate, and get signed by the president. So the fact that that process has dragged on and they haven't managed to reach agreement has delayed the Senate's ability to also put its spending bills forward. So what's happening right now, as I mentioned, is that part of this is that members have to campaign. They're very focused on getting reelected on November 3rd. So they're splitting their focus between being out on the campaign trail or doing virtual town halls with their constituents, and also dispensing with some of this business. But what's by and large going to happen is that right now they're going to be teeing up things that they need to do at the end of the year. They're going to be deciding just how much funding to give to medical research and public health programs. They're going to be deciding what bills they can pass. And then when they come back in November, they're going to have a very frenetic pace until about December 23rd when they adjourn at the end of the year. That's called a lame duck session. They do most of their work after the election because it's harder to get criticized for it, but that means there's a lot to do. So you need things that rise to the top of that priority list that Congress flags as essential to get done before they adjourn at the end of the year. When they adjourn, there's a new Congress that will show up in January, all the people that got elected in November, and they don't inherit what the last Congress was doing. They're going to make their own decisions and start working on their own things. So, and there's going to be new bills and there's going to be new priorities. So it's very important that Congress prioritizes some of these things at the end of the year. And they'll do that by hearing from you. They want to know what their constituents think they should be working on. And in that regard, one of the things that's become a hot button issue again recently was healthcare policy and the basic patient protections that were part of the Affordable Care Act. So guaranteed issue, insurance company can't deny you an insurance plan. No lifetime and annual benefit caps, so you can't outspend your coverage and pay out of pocket. Dependents can be on family coverage until they're 26, so people with chronic illness don't have to worry about getting employer-provided health care at 18, and lowering out-of-pocket costs. So those things are once again center stage because of this. Supreme Court is going to be hearing another case on the legality or constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act in November. And based on how they rule, Congress in its legislative function may have to intervene and put new things back or modify things that the court changed. So even though earlier this year there was a lot of stuff that was political themed campaign, Medicare for all, drug pricing packages, these are things that were more meant for the campaign stump, the soapbox, than as policy. Now there's a really serious policy conversation starting. They're saying, geez, what do we do about these patient protections in healthcare? What do we do about coverage and access in general if the Supreme Court changes, modifies, or wholesale turns over how chronic care coverage works in this country? So, the best way to be part of that process is to make sure your members of Congress know what your experience is. This is a time when they're very interested in hearing from you, and telling them what you have dealt with is a best way to inform their opinion. You might find that gets a lot more traction than what you think a political talking point might be. So your experience and how you've dealt with coverage and access issues is going to be particularly timely and relevant right now. Next slide, please. So a question we often get is, does any of this work? I think Tony did a better job than I could of explaining some of the recent progress, whether it's getting a national day, whether it's having the FDA do a patient-focused drug development meeting, or whether it's having Congress put in what's called report language, like we see on this slide, to tell NIH the type of research or what research they want going on. All helps move our legislative agenda forward. And they do this because you talk to your members of Congress. They do this because members of Congress care. And all of this creates progress on research, funding, treatment development, and coverage and access issues. So it has a known and dramatic impact. Next slide, please. So with that being said, for the bigger context, Congress is campaigning, Congress is deciding what to do at the end of the year. Congress is now very interested in how chronic disease patients are treated in healthcare. What does that mean for our specific issues? And there's really two categories of issues that we're going to be talking about. Some of this is probably in materials that you received already ahead of this event or will be receiving shortly after this event. The first is what we call funding issues. So what do they need to do through the appropriations process? And that's funding for medical research. So the National Institutes of Health, which is the world's foremost biomedical research enterprise, this is government funded, but that money doesn't stay in DC or Bethesda, Maryland. That money goes out to academic health centers all across the country. So the more money there is for research, the more quality research there is getting done. The expression is that in order for your slice of the pie to get bigger, the overall pie's got to get bigger. The second in that funding category is the CDC, and particularly the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's new thing called the Chronic Disease Education and Awareness Program. The NIH typically does pretty well every year. Everybody supports medical research. Public health has never really gotten as much attention. It's gotten a lot of attention recently, but previously not as much. So whereas the NIH budget is robust and often sees good increases, the CDC not so much. So the CDC needs some funding infusions as well. And then the other two issues are legislative issues. What are those bills and legislative items that we want Congress to think about and prioritize as they look at the end of the legislative calendar? The first is a bill called the Safe Step Act, which deals with step therapy or fail first therapy, where you might be switched onto a product that your doctor didn't prescribe because it's cheaper and you have to fail on it before you can go on to something else. And then the fourth is an issue that the Hereditary Angioedema community has been leading on for a few years now, which is the Access to Marketplace Insurance Act. The name is a little bit misleading. Basically, though, as some of you know, this issue has to do with insurance companies. Now that they have guaranteed issue and they have to give chronic disease patients health plans, saying, well, we'll make rules that say if anybody helps you pay your bill, then we'll just kick you off your insurance. No one can help you pay your bill. You got to pay it yourself. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but there is latitude to make these rules, and that's a rule that they've made. And we think that they need to stop that because that's just a backdoor, again, to pre-existing condition discrimination. You target those types of rules to people that have rare, chronic, or costly conditions. And then basically it's like the protections that exist aren't even there. So Congress needs to step in and do that. Access to Marketplace Insurance Act's been a vehicle for them to have an impact. So let's talk about NIH funding in a little bit more detail quick. And I do want to, next slide, please. I do want to make my mandatory plug. Once again, you can provide this information if you want to do a script, if you want to do an email, this will all be there for you. The most critical thing is always telling your story and making your voice heard. Congress is very good at picking up these bill numbers and picking up these funding requests. Don't worry so much about memorizing all this. The more important thing is getting ready to tell your story and educating folks about hereditary angioedema, particularly when there's a rare disease issue. Policymakers probably don't know very much about it. They don't know if they're helping or hurting. So that information about your personal experience often supersedes kind of the basic legislative information. But for those of you that are interested, this is it. So what we're asking for right now for the National Institutes of Health is $44.7 billion. That's a $3 billion funding increase over last year. This is going to represent about 5 years of sustained funding increases. The money that's been coming in through the COVID packages does not count towards this. It doesn't go into NIH's base budget. It's what's called emergency funding, as if there was a flood or natural disaster, and it only goes to COVID. So we need NIH to have this money for its base budget through the normal appropriations process, so rare disease portfolios can continue to expand and move forward. The whole community is asking for this $3 billion increase. We're hopeful that they'll give at least $3 billion, and they're going to support that because people are asking them to stay focused on this. So it's going to be important at the end of this year, and we need to sustain that progress. What happened a few years ago, or about 20 years ago now, is there was a guy named John Porter. He was my congressman. He doubled the NIH budget, took it from about 15 billion annually to 30 billion annually. And then for a long time after that, nothing happened. So if you think about inflation, you think about the need to kind of sustain investment, you had this spike and then complete leveling off. So it's better to just have incremental progress. 3 billion a year every year is better than providing like 7 billion once and then nothing for a while. So they need to remember that they got to invest in NIH year over year. And there's never a year when they can't provide this support. Projections say that the NIH should be funded at over $50 billion if you wanted to make sure all the good science was getting funded. So they're not even at kind of these base levels, but they need to maintain that investment. Right now, we're asking for a $3 billion increase. Next slide, please. So this is a newer issue. Some of you might be familiar with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. About the CDC has a long track record of collaborating with patient organizations and doing different disease work. You know, they have a healthy, they have obesity programs, healthy eating, they have smoking cessation, you know, the things that you think of as kind of basic health information that people need to know. They do physician education, they do public awareness, they do surveillance and epidemiology, like with COVID, contact tracing, that kind of basic frontline data collection. So the CDC has never gotten these same funding increases that NIH is known for. They might get kind of small ones. This has put a lot of pressure on the CDC's budget, particularly when there's a lot of chronic diseases to keep tabs on. So a couple of years ago, the CDC made a decision. They said, if Congress doesn't give us direct line item funding, for example, let's say that we're going to do $5 million for breast cancer, we're just not going to do it. We only are going to work in areas where Congress gives us money. These are public health experts. Congress is not public health experts. So, you know, the workaround that the House has come up with to solve this problem is, why don't we give the CDC a discretionary pot of money that will then let them decide what are the best projects on an annual basis, and we'll let them go back to collaborating with different organizations like the Hereditary Angioedema Association, and let them work on different conditions based on what the needs are. The House funded this program last year at $3 million, called the Chronic Disease Education and Awareness Program. The funding was not included in the final bill. Not uncommon. You have a new program. People say, what is this? They want to make sure they know everything about it, but it's back again this year. The House has proposed $3 million again. And the Senate needs to capitulate to that position and also support having this new program. Then the CDC will start to have new resources. It will start to be able to do collaborations. And this will work in a fashion similar to something like the DoD research program, where there are conditions that are named or selected and the budget grows, and then allows a lot of these new activities. So they got to support this program. They need to make sure the CDC can work with chronic and rare disease groups to do timely outreach that's important, and they have to establish this program. So $3 million for the CDC for the Chronic Disease Education and Awareness Program. Next slide, please. So now, what are the legislative issues? What are these bills that we want Congress to be considering at the end of the year? So the first is can we go back one? I think we... Yeah, okay, perfect. So the first is the Safe Step Act. The Safe Step Act is the bill that deals with step therapy. It doesn't ban step therapy. It puts guardrails in place. It puts in a framework that's patient-centered. It doesn't say step therapy can never happen. It says if you get your drug switched on you, though, you have a right to know that that happened, that the prescription you got was different from what your doctor provided. Your doctor also gets to know that that happened. And if they're an expert or a specialist, they can say, no, 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 I prescribed this particular prescription for a reason for this patient. I'm going to overrule the decision that the insurance company is making. Or the doctor could say, oh, I didn't even know there was a cheaper version available. Sure, use that instead. But this ensures that transparency and ensures that the patient-physician relationship remains central in healthcare. So there is a House bill and a Senate bill. The House bill is HR 2279. The Senate bill is S2546. Both of these are bipartisan. They got dozens of co-sponsors. What would be great is if when Congress came back at the end of the year, they decided they're going to pass this bill, so it doesn't have to start the process over again next year and get those dozens of co-sponsors again. So telling your members of Congress now that you want them to support this and work on this is a strong message that we want this done before January, before they leave town. They need to pass the Safe Step Act. Next slide, please. And finally, the Access to Marketplace Insurance Act. This bill has been changing as the problem has been changing. So this bill now deals with the issue of copay accumulators. So copay accumulators is kind of a new thing. Before, they wouldn't let someone help you pay your bills. Now the new thing is, oh, pay your bill, but then we just won't count it to your out-of-pocket maximum. So the language has been changing every Congress to adapt to how this issue has been handled or used to discriminate against chronic disease patients. Senator Cramer, who we're going to hear from, is getting getting ready to introduce the bill again. What we want is Democratic and Republican members of the Senate to support the bill too, the way that they did in the House when the bill had over 170 House co-sponsors last Congress. We want that kind of support again. And we want the House to reintroduce the bill. So we're asking members of the House of Representatives to support this issue and lead this legislation. And we're asking senators to join Senator Cramer in championing this issue so he can help resolve this as the lead. Next slide, please. So really quickly, how do we do outreach? We're not on Capitol Hill. We aren't going to be walking over to the Senate buildings. Real simple. You can find your House representative by going to house.gov and you just put your zip code in the upper corner. If you want to find out who your 2 senators are, you just go to senate.gov and you select senators and you pick your state and it takes you right to their websites. This websites are going to have a 202 phone number. It's the DC office. You can call them. They will get back to you. They're going to have local offices, which may or may not be open based on what the health situation is in your area. And they're going to maybe have an email contact form. But if you do call them and talk to them, the staff member that you want to find is the Health LA or Health Legislative Assistant. That's the person you want to leave a message for, or that's the person you want to send an email directly to. So the Health LA is the health staffer for each of these offices, and that's the person you want to know. We also know that information. John and I can provide that to you upon request, but we do think it's important to know how to talk to these offices and get that information and share your story. You might want to ask if you can come over for an in-person meeting if you're comfortable with that. Most offices probably aren't going to be open. Calling and emailing is going to be the best way to get a hold of the Health LA, but there are other options to you that you will see when you visit the websites. The reason we can't organize all this is because every office is different with how they're handling this pandemic, and all of them are approaching these meetings in different ways. So the key thing is for you as a constituent to talk to them and say, this is what I'm trying to get to you, find out who that Health LA is and find a way to make contact with them. Next slide, please. So really quick, just some tips for doing this. You just want to look at this kind of prep packet you have or the legislative agenda. You want to jot down 4 or 5 brief points, and you want to make sure that the number one thing you remember is to use this as an opportunity to tell your story. It's easy to say co-sponsor the Safe Step Act. It's easy to say, please support the Chronic Disease Education and Awareness Program at CDC. The one thing, though, that folks are often overlooking when they're thinking about those details is they forget to say what hereditary angioedema is. They forget to say how it's affected them or their family. They forget to talk about maybe things that have happened to them in the community. That stuff is so important for these visits. And I'm sure we'll hear about that from some of our advocates that will be talking today. But next slide, please. And then, of course, the most important thing, as we always say, is tell your story. And I want to use this as an opportunity to come back to one thing that is clearly not here, which is people are saying, geez, if there's been so much talk in the media lately about the Affordable Care Act and the 4 pillars of patient protection, how come we're not there? How come we're not, lobbying on this? Because this is a separation of powers and a basic kind of civics 101 issue. The Supreme Court is hearing that case. They are not, listening to constituent outreach. It's not their job. That's the role of Congress. So depending on however the Supreme Court rules, Congress may have to step in and do something. The best way for Congress to know what to do if they need to change how healthcare works is to know your story. They need to know what hereditary angioedema is. They need to know how it affects you. They need to know what it's like for you to see a doctor or get diagnosed. They need to know what it's like for you to get the medication you need. That way, when they say, geez, we really have to come in now and think about how we're going to fix things or adjust things for how the healthcare system works for chronic disease patients, you want them to think of you. You want them to think of your story, and you want them to think, geez, how do we make sure we're doing things that work for this person? So that's why that telling your story is so important. It's a timely example, and we will answer some questions at the end, but for now, I'm going to turn things back over to John.
Thanks, Dane. We are always appreciative for the help and the guidance of the Health and Medicine Council of Washington. So now we would like to hear from some of our patient community members. It's my pleasure to introduce Miss Cody Brown.
Hi, my name is Cody Brown, and I'm from Houston, Texas, and I would like to tell you my story. My first encounter with HAE took place when I was 17 years old at my first job. That first day of work unknowingly brought about a series of unexpected events into my life. Events that I would never forget. The work shift started with simple tasks that consisted of chopping potatoes into fries, smearing butter on buns, and taking orders from hungry customers. After I finished my shift that day, I felt a heavy feeling of being tired take hold of my body to the point where I fell into bed without having dinner or a conversation about the eventful day at work. After 3 hours of sleep, I was awakened by a sharp pain in my foot. After taking a closer look, I saw it was twice the size that it normally was. "What is this?" slipped out of my mouth after seeing the sight. Little did I know this uninvited guest had a name. Unfortunately, the explanation didn't come until I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, after both my feet and my hands were swollen to their peak. While in the hospital, intrigued doctors that seemed more like spectators would stop by during the day with their colleagues to see the sight. "That Hulk toy that you attach to your hands that are big and huge," one doctor stated as she released my fluid-filled hands from her grip, letting it hit the bed with a subtle thump. "That's what your hands look like." Some of the doctors were so indulged in their curiosity that they lacked empathy. By the second week, ignoring statements like that came easier and easier, along with also trying to black out the pain. I lost all feeling, but I had a mission to get released. So during the day, I would simply wait for the good news I prayed for during the night, a diagnosis, accompanied by news of a cure. That day finally came when my doctor darted into the room with the tail of his lab coat flying behind him. "Well, we believe we have a rare disease called hereditary angioedema, and we have medicine for you." I was happy there was a diagnosis, but hearing the word disease sent shivers down my spine. While the doctor explained what was going on with my body, I spaced out after he stated it was a lifelong disease with no cure, but instead medicine to sustain the swells. It felt like the sudden breath of fresh air was cut short from the stench of uncertainty. Eventually, I was released from the hospital with instructions on how to tend to my new lifelong companion. My main physician at the time was concerned that I didn't have more medicine, but after we told them we didn't have enough to cover the cost, she informed me about medicine assistance. That's when I was introduced to charitable assistance programs. They help pay for my copay, and now I don't have to worry about fighting off death because I don't have enough to support my treatment. Having access to charitable assistance programs made it possible for me to go to college and get a career that I love. Once life started back again for me, I pretended that that companion didn't exist, and I tried to completely erase it from my life. Eventually, I realized how deep in denial I was about the serious and extreme impact that this disease would have on my life. HAE would remind me of its presence, whether I believed in it or not. The event that led to my eye-opening experience occurred the day after coming home from vacationing with my family. Upon arriving home, I started to feel a little tickle in my throat and an overwhelming heaviness that traveled from my head to my feet, a feeling I had not felt since my first attack. I shrugged off the thought of that memory and blamed my symptoms on seasonal allergies and being exhausted from the trip, so I took a Claritin and laid down for bed. The next morning, I woke up fighting to breathe. Suddenly, the presence of hereditary angioedema that I tried so hard to suppress was overpowering my efforts to breathe. I didn't know what was going on or what to do. After realizing that I was home alone, I knew that I had to make a quick decision to save my life, one that seemed to be slipping away with each heart-pounding moment. I thought to myself that I needed to calm down and think. The first thought that came to my head was my mom because I wanted the chance to speak to her one last time. That quick decision saved my life before she was able to contact my brother, who was nearby, and took me to the hospital. I was blessed that day and made a promise to myself to transform the way I perceive HAE as a burden. HAE has shown me over the years the better parts of myself that wouldn't have been possible without overcoming the obstacles that I had to face throughout my life. Without the assistance programs that helped me gain access to these lifelong sustaining therapies, I would have been one less college student trying to make a life for herself, one less entrepreneur with a dream to own her own business, or one less mother hoping to have beautiful kids one day. Now I can live a normal with the grip of HAE on my future behind me. I appreciate life and appreciate all the charitable assistance programs that help patients like myself live a better life. I'm thankful for my story, the story of having undeniable strength, perseverance, and keeping my faith in God through it all. Thank you.
Thank you, Cully. Next, we will hear from another HAE patient, Mr. John Harrington.
Hi, my name is John Harrington, and I'm from Guilderland, New York, and I have hereditary angioedema. My battle with hereditary angioedema began as far back as I can remember. As a child, I had frequent swells that would affect my abdomen, face, and extremities. If I had an abdominal or facial swell, my parents would usually take me to the emergency room where the staff there would give me steroids and Benadryl. Each time I swelled, the doctors would tell me that I must have gotten bit by a spider. This was confusing because our house never really had spiders roaming around, but I naturally believed what I was told. I can remember many of my birthdays and those of my friends where I would have a swell and wonder why this had to happen to me. Most of the time, I would not participate in these special events because I was either in so much pain or I was embarrassed about how I looked. On my 12th birthday, I had a sleepover with friends and the plan was to stay up all night. The rule that night was if someone fell asleep, they were fair game and they would likely wake up with Sharpie artwork all over their face. That birthday, I had a facial swell and I was given my usual Benadryl and steroid cocktail. Fortunately for me that night, my friends understood that I was having that thing happen to me and I would probably fall asleep for my medicine. Naturally, I did, but they spared me the hassle of having to scrub permanent marker off my face the next day. As I continued to swell throughout my teenage years, I missed a number of activities from sporting events to school dances. Boy, did I really hate those spiders. I was jealous of Peter Parker because spiders turned him into a superhero, but it just caused me pain and suffering. It became a coping mechanism just to laugh at myself and the way I appeared during a swell. In college, it became my thing with friends stopping by to see my various HAE swells, taking pictures and laughing with me. When I met my wife at 25, I told her that I thought I had this rare disease that was called hereditary angioedema. My sister had researched this disease, and as a physician's assistant, she had unofficially diagnosed me with HAE. I told my wife that it was no big deal. During an attack, I typically hid for days in my bedroom, under the covers, hiding from her and our family. As we all know, during an abdominal attack, the pain mimics that of contractions. And I would have gut-wrenching pain for a short period of time, and then it would subside for a few minutes. It was a running joke in our family that my wife caused these swells because during one abdominal attack, it just so happened that each time she came into the room to check on me, I would be doubled over in pain on the bed. The joking ended one day in 2008 when my life changed forever. I had my first throat swell and could no longer hide how painful and severe my illness was. We rushed to the emergency room where I was intubated and placed into a drug-induced coma for several days. My wife never left my side. Since this disease is so rare, doctors had no idea what was happening to me. My wife assured them that this was probably called hereditary angioedema. The physicians printed out articles from the internet in an attempt to figure out what to do with me. When I woke up, I knew things would be very different for me. I just couldn't continue to be passive about HAE, and we needed a plan to prevent the attacks. We finally found a physician that had some experience with hereditary angioedema, and I began taking androgens, but unfortunately my personality changed, and the androgens had several other negative physical side effects. Thankfully, my wife became an advocate and made it her mission to learn more about HAE and teach local doctors, family, and friends about my disease. This is when we discovered the Hereditary Angioedema Association. For once in my life, I finally had some hope. More importantly, I knew there were other people out there just like me. After attending an HAEA conference and learning about newly approved therapies, my wife and I fought with my doctor to take me off of the androgens so I could try one of the newly approved therapies. I'm convinced that my physician at the time was upset with us because we actually knew more about the disease than he did. He refused to switch my medications. We left the office that day and we never returned. Luckily, I was able to find my savior, Dr. Selliston. During my first appointment with him, I discovered that he had been studying HAE for many, many years and was more than willing to test out some of the new medications on the market. My life changed forever after that appointment. Since then, I've been on a few different medications and my swells are currently very well controlled. The HAE patient community has seen so many amazing changes over the last 10 years or so. We now have several treatment options available to us. Many of us can finally live normal lives. As a parent with a child that has HAE, there's nothing worse than watching your child suffer from an abdominal or a facial attack. Because of the HAEA, my wife and I no longer have to sit hopelessly and watch our daughter cry out in pain for days on end, like when I was a child. Because of the HAEA, we aren't forced to have our daughter try and fail on cheaper, less effective treatment options before our physician can prescribe something that has been proven effective. Not only is this dangerous for the patient, but it's actually more expensive in the long run. Now we can actually choose which treatment option we would like for our daughter. I'm 100% convinced that these changes would never have happened without the hard work and dedication of the Hereditary Angioedema Association. Because of their advocacy, we now have 7 treatment options available to choose from. One way the HAEA has advocated for us is through Capitol Hill Day. This day is extremely important because our congressional leaders need to understand that their constituents expect them to maintain and strengthen patient protections in the healthcare system. The best way to educate legislators about our needs and earn their support for patient protections is to make a personal connection with their offices and make our voices heard. I've attended a few Capitol Hill days, and each year is better than the last. It's promising when a congressional staffer or a congressional leader himself or herself actually remembers your story from previous meetings and asks you personal questions from previous Hill days. You can tell that the story you tell them from your often tumultuous journey with HAE has actually made an impact on that person. Hopefully, then they decide to sign on to whatever you're asking of them, whether it's increases in NIH funding of HAE research or the importance of having access to charitable assistance programs. One hurdle that many HAE patients must overcome is the tremendous cost of HAE treatments. Most of the medications cost more in 1 month than many people make in a year. Luckily, there are charitable organizations that offset these expenses so that patients have access to appropriate treatments for HAE. Without the assistance of charitable organizations, patients would not have access to these life-saving medications. Sadly, some states are trying to prevent charitable organizations from paying for these medications and treatments. As an HAE patient and a parent of an HAE patient, it angers me and makes absolutely no sense to me. I would like to conclude by thanking all the staff at the Hereditary Angioedema Association for everything that you've done for me, my family, and the rest of the HAE community. I'm confident that through the hard work of the HAEA, we will have access to even more treatment options, continued access to charitable assistance programs, and eventually find a cure. Thank you, Tony, and of course, thank you to the Hereditary Angioedema Association.
Thank you for sharing your story with us, John. Up next, we have Miss Anita Wilkerson.
Hello, I'm Anita from Mississippi. I presented with hereditary angioedema at the age of 6, but was not diagnosed until I was 18. Throughout my childhood, this disease was the bane of my existence. It seemed that every big event was foiled by uncontrolled stomach pain and vomiting. I would try to write it out, but to no avail. The times when the pain and vomiting would not subside always led to a dreaded trip to the ER and the accompanying sticks and prods. I spent my high school years preparing for a career I was no longer sure I could attain due to this mysterious affliction. At 17, I began suffering airway constrictions, and at 18, I was finally diagnosed with HAE. Dr. Michael Frank of NIH had studied the disease and frequently consulted with doctors during my many trips to the ER. Even though the disease had been identified and named, it was poorly understood and not well managed. It was like walking a tightrope with a faulty net. There were very few options to prevent attacks, and they didn't always work. The options to treat attacks were equally scarce. Mostly, it was to get to the ER and hope. The three events happened which brought about major changes. In 1983, Congress passed the Orphan Drug Act to incentivize development of drugs to treat rare diseases. In 1990, the Human Genome Project, funded by Congress, began. And in 2000, the U.S. Hereditary Angioedema Association was founded to advocate for more research with a goal of providing for more patient access to treatment and prevention of attacks, ultimately improving the quality of life. Working with pharmaceutical companies, the HAEA advocated to leverage the Orphan Drug Act and the Genome Project, completed in 2003, to bring drugs to the patient, first to treat acute attacks and later to prevent them. As a result of congressional funding for basic and clinical research, 7 FDA-approved treatments have been developed for patient use in less than 20 years. The impact of these treatments on my life has been profound. Currently, I've been attack-free for over 6 months, even though I underwent a major surgery during that time. I no longer worry about an attack spoiling a special occasion, an unexpected trip to the ER, or having to educate an attending physician while suffering through a throat swell. You could say that my life is normal. Even with so much progress, we must continue to fund basic and clinical research with the hope that soon, through gene therapy or other discoveries, this disease and its burdens will become just a part of history and not our everyday lives. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Anita. We will now hear from 2 of the HAEA patient community champions on Capitol Hill. First is Senator Cramer, who represents North Dakota, and before he was elected to the Senate, he served on the powerful Energy and Commerce Committee in the House of Representatives. During his time in the House, Congressman Cramer led the Access to Marketplace Insurance Act and has championed access to charitable assistance issues. He has always been a good friend and an attentive ear to the HAE community. Senator Cramer is also currently working to introduce the Access to Marketplace Insurance Act in the Senate. Senator Cramer?
Thank you for the invitation to address you today, and it's my pleasure as always to join the hereditary angioedema community and express my continued commitment to the important issue of charitable premium assistance. One bill we're working on in the Senate, of course, is the Access to Marketplace Insurance Act, which addresses the arbitrary barriers to patient assistance. It's absolutely essential. Patients with life-threatening medical conditions have the opportunity to utilize charitable assistance to maintain access to life-sustaining therapy. Simply, we need to let charities be charitable. Altogether, no, we need to let charities be charitable. But the fact remains that many policymakers are unfamiliar with the rare disease experience. We've been working hard to gain other supporters in the Senate and maximize the potential for passing this important legislation. This is why it is so important to share your story with policymakers. Using your voice to educate your elected officials about your experiences helps them work on your behalf and build support for legislative efforts like this one. Thanks again for allowing me to join you today, and I look forward to continuing to work with you all this year and in the next Congress when hopefully we can all get together in person. God bless you.
Thank you, Senator Cramer. Up next is Congressman Connolly, who represents Virginia's 11th District and the US HAEA headquarters. Congressman Connolly was first elected in 2008 and has distinguished himself as a true patient champion since that time. He is a supporter of medical research and public health funding, as well as an advocate for patient-centered protections in healthcare. Congressman Connolly also leads a letter in support of annual funding priorities for the HAE community specifically. Congressman Connolly?
Thank you all for inviting me to join you today. I'm Congressman Jerry Conley, and I'm proud to represent the United States Hereditary Angioedema Association and many passionate hereditary angioedema patient advocates throughout my district and, in fact, throughout the United States. I was first elected in 2008, and I've been working on improving health outcomes for patients impacted by rare and chronic illnesses ever since that time. My colleagues and I passed the Affordable Care Act and its 4 pillars of patient protection in 2010. And we've been working to ensure that the healthcare system protects families facing serious illnesses such as this. One of the ways we continue to fight for progress in this community is by increasing funding for medical research as well as public health programs. Congress has provided a significant investment in the National Institutes of Health to facilitate scientific progress that leads to better diagnostic tools, improved treatments, and quality information. For fiscal year 2021, I've requested a $3 billion increase in that funding for NIH. Like many members of Congress, there was a time when I was not familiar with hereditary angioedema or the needs of this patient community. However, that was quickly changed when passionate local advocates took the time to meet with me and used their personal stories to educate me and my office about the obstacles they face. I can't overstate just how important it is for you to advocate, to speak out for family, and to make your voice heard for your community. Your members of Congress need to hear from you, and they can only benefit from understanding your experiences and perspectives as they work on health policy items. Your advocacy is more important than ever as we once again face the prospect of a repeal of the Affordable Care Act and its patient protections. I look forward to working with my colleagues in the House of Representatives to once again push for meaningful funding increases for medical research and public health programs, and to continue to defend progress in making the healthcare system more patient-centered. Thanks again for allowing me to join you virtually today. I look forward to seeing you in the hereditary angioedema community in Capitol Hill again in person as soon as it's safe. Stay well and God bless.
I'd like to thank Senator Cramer and Congressman Connolly for taking time out of their schedules to speak with the HAEA community today, as well as Dane Christensen from the Health and Medicine Council of Washington. I'd also like to thank our patient speakers for sharing their very personal stories. Sharing stories about the impact that HAE has on our lives and our families can often be painful, but they also showcase the strength and resilience of our community. These real-life testimonies remind us why we must continue to push for patient protections and ensure every patient has access to the treatment of their choice, as well as the assistant programs that makes access to those treatments possible. COVID-19 has really changed how we communicate, but it is imperative that we continue to advocate through alternative means. Access to treatment and funding for research programs are vital to the HAE community. Please join me in reaching out to your congressional representatives, and let's continue to inform them and educate them on these important issues. We do have a question here submitted today. It says, Congressman Joe Courtney's office asked me if they were attending the Safe Step Act meeting on Thursday with other constituents. Will the HAEA be going to that? Dane, I believe you had an answer for us.
Yes, thank you. Really quick, I just wanted to add that there were a couple of questions about access and coverage issues. And I wanted to mention quickly that, access and coverage is always a difficult challenge when you have a rare disease, and insurance companies or payers might have a difficult time with these blanket policies. But the HA community is really quite fortunate to have a great staff, and Tony Castaldo. Nobody fights harder than these folks to resolve these coverage and access issues. They're a tremendous resource if you have a specific question about your own coverage and care. The broader question about the Safe Step meeting, I think, is an important one. It points out a reason why it's relevant that we are working on these bills. And I do want to mention that the outreach may seem a little complicated this year, but it's very easy. We have a PDF that has all the materials a congressional office might need. There's an easy way to contact the health LAs. We can provide you with that information upon request. It's going to be very straightforward, and we're glad that this virtual format has given us a chance to expand our footprint. But to answer that question specifically, there are a couple of states that have tighter insurance restrictions, and they tend to be in the Northeast. So if you look at charitable assistance, for example, I believe there's 41 states that have health plans that have banned copay or premium assistance, and 9 that have not. I believe those 9 that have not are almost exclusively in the Northeast. Similarly, Connecticut right now, I believe on the state level, because insurance can be managed on a state level, is both considering bans on copay accumulator programs, saying that you don't count the copay assistance, and also working to insert guardrails in step therapy. It may be a good thing if your state has done these. I believe there's 7 states right now that have banned copay accumulators, but the type of healthcare you get and that fact that healthcare is not discriminatory shouldn't be based on where you live. So that's why passing things like the Safe Step Act and passing things like the Access to Marketplace Insurance Act on the national level are so important. That sets a standard for the whole country where you might not have this patchwork where some states are different. So there is a meeting coming up in Connecticut. The US HAEA participates both in the broader patient coalitions on step therapy and on copay, and also on charitable assistance. So these are events that we're monitoring and participating in. But Connecticut on the state level right now, I do believe is considering a state level ban on copay accumulators and also some state level action on step therapy. But that is something that we are keeping very close tabs on. So.
Thank you, Dane. And another question here was asked if we would be emailing out the slide deck after the meeting. Yes, we will be sending the slide deck to all participants. And prior to this meeting, you should have also received an email containing materials that you can use for your advocacy outreach. We will be sending, including those and the follow-up email as well. In that email, you'll find a sample script and talking points that you can send directly to your representative's health legislative assistant. Please use that sample script and the talking points that are included to help with your online or phone conversations. I remember if you are sending an email message to the Health LA, please remember to attach the community's 2020 advocacy materials documents that were included in that email. So we have another question here. What about states who don't allow copay assistance because my pharmacy resides in the state, but my state of residence doesn't have this restriction? Will this be addressed?
Same answer. It's why we have to pass a national law. That law makes everybody follow the same rules and sets minimum standards for the whole country. It avoids these issues where you might have one standard of care in Mississippi and a different standard of care in New Hampshire. At least we have the basic essential protections in place. Not allowing copay accumulators, not allowing dangerous step therapy without restrictions, and not banning copay assistance for no reason. It's passing a bill, one bill for the whole country is just more straightforward than approaching 50 different states with 50 different sets of rules.
Great, thank you. And with that, we will go ahead and wrap up. I know it's at the top of the hour for everyone. I would like to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to join us for the US HAEA's 2020 Virtual Capitol Hill Day. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions at John, that's JOHN @haea.org. And please be on the lookout for the follow-up email containing all of the advocacy materials. Hope everyone has a great evening.